Hi, this is Joel Rosenberg, founder and editor-in-chief of All Israel News, coming to you from Jerusalem, and I'm speaking to Ambassador Dennis Ross on today's interview, the first of three parts. Ambassador Ross has been a senior advisor in all kinds of Middle East peacemaking and other elements to the Middle East in both Republican and Democrat administrations for several decades now. He worked with both George W. Bush and George H.W. Bush, but more particularly, and I think, and more recently, what people would know him from was with President Obama, Secretary Hillary Clinton, and of course, obviously, by definition, therefore, he knows incoming President Joe Biden very well and has worked with him and his team. So, Ambassador Ross, thank you so much for taking some time out of a very intense and busy and historic week to talk to us about what's ahead in 2021 in the Middle East.
Look, Joel, it's my pleasure to be with you and happy to talk about it. And this is a time of change, and I'm very hopeful that much of this change can be positive.
I appreciate it. And I appreciate the help that you've given me as I've gotten to travel in and meet with a number of the Arab leaders in the Middle East. You've been very, very helpful in just help briefing me and letting me test questions against you that maybe I should or should not ask of these various leaders. So here we are in a big transition from President Trump to President Biden. I'm not sure if there could be a sharper contrast. And the question is that everybody's asking is, where are we going from here? One of the points you have made, and we're going to be linking to a transition paper that you just wrote, where you're currently residing at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. And your paper is on the coming Iran nuclear talks, openings and obstacles. Let's start with how serious is the Iran threat? Not just, we've known it for some time, but they've made some moves in recent weeks and months that are particularly disturbing. Why don't you walk us through what those moves are, and then how do you assess what's their objectives?
Sure. Good question to begin our discussion, Joel. Thank you, and nice to be with you.
Great.
I would say first, they're enriching to 20%. Enriching to 20% is very significant. I consider it the most significant of all the breaches of the JCPOA. They didn't walk away from the JCPOA for 1 year after the Trump administration left the JCPOA. They began to walk away in May of 2019. The most serious breach in my mind, we can go all through all of them, but the most serious one is enriching to 20%. Why? Because the 20% is the dividing line between low enriched uranium and high enriched uranium. To go from what they're permitted in the JCPOA to enrich to 3.67%, to purify up to 20%, the ability to make that leap is a tougher challenge than it is to go from 20% to 90% weapons grade. So the time it takes to be able to perfect the approach to enriching to get up to 20% is actually more demanding, takes more time. Then once you've crossed that threshold, being able to go up to weapons grade is much less of a leap. So number one. Number two, bear in mind that Prime Minister Netanyahu said in September 2012, when he was speaking to the UN General Assembly, and he had a diagram that if Iran achieved one bomb's worth of 20% enriched low enriched uranium, that for Israel, that was the red line. Meaning if Iran had one bomb's worth of 20% enriched material, that would trigger an Israeli military response. So here's Iran now suddenly announcing they're enriching to 20%. Number one. Number two.
Just to be clear for our viewers and readers, essentially they're going right up to the red line, but not quite over it. Is that how you see it?
No, I think they're crossing.
They're going over.
Yes,
okay.
They're basically 20%. They have, just to put this in perspective, the Tehran research reactor, which was provided by the United States to Iran, obviously before the Shah fell.
Right.
We didn't provide, after sanctions began, after the taking of the American hostages, we didn't provide the fuel for that. For a long time, they got it from Argentina. And then during the Obama administration, we thought there was an opening to get them to ship out what was the raw material they were producing, and in return for the raw material they were producing, they would be provided fuel. Now, that is 19.7%, 19.75% enrichment. So it's just below the 20%. And you know, they're saying they're enriching to 20%. Is it 19.8%? Is it 20.5%? 20% really is a threshold. And this is not an accident. This is a deliberate signal they're sending. And along with the seizure of the South Korean tanker, and the fact that they've announced that they're now fabricating uranium metal. They're developing uranium metal. They're claiming it's another way of producing fuel, which is true, but it's also, if you want to build a bomb, you have to be able to encase it, and that's why you fabricate uranium metal. When you take these three steps, not to mention there's been an increase in the bombardment on our embassy within Baghdad.
Well, and the attack on the Saudi oil facilities,
right?
Those are tankers, right. Yeah.
But that was already more than a year ago. I'm talking about what they're doing right now. What they started doing, in the last 2 months. These things, I think, are designed to force themselves onto the agenda. They know with the Biden administration coming in, anyone can tell what's the preoccupation: the pandemic,
right? The
economy. The president-elect, will be president tomorrow, has declared 100 million dosage within the first 100 days. They know the priority is domestic. They also know that for Biden, the Middle East is not a priority per se, and when it comes to foreign policy. What the Iranians are doing is trying to put themselves on the agenda. They're basically saying, okay, we're going to do these things and you better address us because we're going to be a problem otherwise.
All right, just to be clear, that would be the most rational scenario. The other scenario is they're moving towards the breakout, but then they might not have announced it. So right. If they're going down this, you need to deal with us. The reason for that would be, presumably, they want to get out of the sanctions. They need relief because they're suffocating.
Absolutely. Look, the reality of the Trump administration is they did not succeed in changing Iran's behavior. We're recounting it right now. Their behavior in the region didn't change, and in the last year, they have moved from a position where they were about a year's breakout time away to probably between 2 and 3 months breakout time to weapons-grade fissile material. So they didn't change their behavior, but they're under enormous economic pressure. Right. And the message is why they're trying to make themselves an issue is because they want sanctions relief. They are saying sanctions relief. In fact, the Supreme Leader on January 8th gave a speech in which he said, the Americans, the West is obligated to lift the sanctions immediately. We don't care if they get it back into the JCPOA. That's not the issue for us. The issue for us is the sanctions relief. And he says, if they resume their commitments, we'll fulfill ours. Now, that's the mirror image of what Biden has said. Biden has said, we'll do compliance for compliance, meaning once you're back in compliance, we can lift the nuclear-related sanctions that we're obligated to lift under the JCPOA. These are exactly mirror image, but they're not the same, right? Each has a different sequence in mind.
So we're going to link, as I said, to your paper so people can really walk it through, and they should, so they can understand your full argument. Why don't you give us the synopsis of what you think the Biden team should do, and some of the risks, in a summary format.
Okay, so what I just described is a kind of what actually sounds like they have something in common in mind when they don't. The Iranians want us to go first. Biden wants them to go first. Avril Haines today, in her confirmation hearings on the Hill, to be the director of national intelligence, she was asked a question about this, and she said, compliance for compliance, it'll take a long time to get there. We're a long ways from that. So these are actually two different views. I am suggesting, since this is going to take time in any event, and because there's such uniform Republican opposition to the JCPOA, and because the Israel, the Saudis, and the Emiratis also view it as kind of an emblem, why not take a step back? You want to reduce the threat that the Iranians pose. You want to resume a diplomatic process, but you want to retain your leverage so that you can affect Iran on bigger issues. So I've suggested a less for less deal. What I mean by that is the Iranians, because they have more than 12 times the amount of low-enriched uranium stockpiled than they're permitted to have under the terms of the JCPOA. So they're at 2,600 kilograms. They went down to close to 200 as part of the JCPOA. So I'm saying, all right, let's say they draw back to 800 to 1,000 kilograms, not all the way to the JCPOA limits. They dismantle 2 cascades of advanced centrifuges, which are dramatically more efficient than the IR1s, the primitive centrifuges they have used for most of their enrichment. These are at least 6 times as efficient. So the combination of a stockpile and much more efficient centrifuges, and they weren't permitted to install those centrifuges until the year 2025. I'm saying those get dismantled. They stop the 20%. They stop the fabrication of uranium enrichment. And what they get in return for that is we allow them one of 2 things. They have overseas bank accounts that have monies that were paid to them for their oil, but were frozen. So they never got the money. And because of the sanctions, they're frozen. They don't have access to it. Truth is, there's about $100 billion in those frozen bank accounts. We could provide limited access, not anything close to what they have in those, but we could provide limited access so they would get some limited sanctions relief. What I'm suggesting, in effect, is the following. They don't have to go all the way back to the JCPOA limits, but they have to do enough that stretches that breakout time back up to, say, 6 or 7 months as opposed to 2 or 3. And in return for doing that, they will get some limited sanctions relief. The benefit for us is we retain the sanctions regime. We're giving them only partial relief. The benefits for them is they get some relief, and it's clear that they need some relief. Now,
and
why?
Actually, just briefly, you also noted another possible scenario. Rather than releasing some of the bank accounts, you could provide their ability to sell some oil, which would keep the money in the banks, keep that leverage on, and then regulate or that valve, as it were. So you're giving a few options, none of which will probably be popular in Congress or in Jerusalem or in Riyadh or Abu Dhabi or even Manama. But you're saying it might be better than the year going on with them doubling and tripling their high enriched uranium stockpile.
Right. First of all, if you don't call a halt to what they're doing, then the odds of military force being used go up dramatically.
Yeah. By Israel.
No, but certainly by Israel, because if that one bomb threshold of 20% is still a red line, and I suspect it still is, then the risk of action or miscalculation goes up significantly. So the value of what I'm suggesting is we retain our leverage, we reduce the immediacy of the threat, we stretch it out. And we say, okay, for the next 12 to 24 months, you then try to negotiate what would be a JCPOA 2.0 that extends what Biden says he wants. Biden spelled out his objectives: prevent a nuclear weapon, restore a credible path to negotiations based on compliance for compliance, using the JCPOA as the springboard then to a negotiation to extend the sunset provisions so they don't lapse in 2030, to talk about and address the ballistic missile threat, and to deal with what are the threats within the region.
And this would test whether the Iranians would negotiate at all, is essentially what you're saying.
And what right.
Well, make a concluding point, and then we're going to have to pick this up on the next program, because I think we've really got to understand now what are Biden's objectives and how he might navigate through this. But why don't you draw that to
the key reason why I think that both the Israelis, the other regional states and even the Republicans could accept what I'm suggesting, is that we retain our leverage. What's the greatest single concern they collectively have? It's that if you go back to the JCPOA, what incentive then do the Iranians still have to deal with these other issues? And I'm suggesting here's a way for us to preserve our leverage and not to give it away. What the Trump administration did is build our leverage. They weren't able to translate it, but you're not going to change Iran's behavior without leverage. I want us to preserve our leverage in a way that gives us the best chance to be able to change Iran's behavior by also, in a sense, bringing all the stakeholders in behind it. The Europeans will also likely support this because they want us back in diplomacy. So I'm trying to reconcile what are a set of conflicting pressures that the Biden administration is going to face, maximize the leverage we have, because it's not just economic pressure, it's also political isolation, which matters to the Iranians. They don't see themselves as being like North Korea.
Right. Fascinating, and it couldn't be more timely. Ambassador Dennis Ross, thank you very much. We're also going to have a link to your fabulous new book with your colleague, David Makovsky, Be Strong and of Good Courage, looking at the four most consequential Israeli prime ministers in modern Israeli history. I love it. I've given it away to many friends for both Hanukkah and Christmas. We'll have a link to the Amazon account for that as well. We'll pick this up on the next broadcast. Thank you so much. I'm Joel Rosenberg in Jerusalem for All Israel News.